My brother-in-law died suddenly, and now my sister and her kids have to sell their home. That's why I told my husband we could not put off getting life insurance any longer. An agent offered us a 10-year, $500,000 policy for nearly $50 a month. Then we called SelectQuote. SelectQuote found us identical coverage for only $19 a month, a savings of $369 a year.
Whether you need a $500,000 policy or a $5 million policy, SelectQuote could save you more than 50% on term life insurance.
For your free quote, go to SelectQuote.com. SelectQuote.com. That's SelectQuote.com.
SelectQuote. We shop. You save. Full details on example policies at SelectQuote.com/commercials.
With no fees or minimums and no overdraft fees, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. Even easier than choosing to keep the Grinch away from the toy drive.
Who's going to deliver the toys to the kids?
What about me, the Grinch?
No.
Yep, even easier than that.
You steal the presents one time.
With no fees or minimums and no overdraft fees, is it even a decision? That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet?
Terms apply. Capital One NA, member FDIC. Copyright Dr. Seuss Enterprises. Copyright Turner Entertainment Company.
Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibis? Welcome to part 2 of day 22 of the George Wagner trial. Just wanted to go ahead and kind of finish up the second half of today's testimony. It wasn't super long and could be said it was quite entertaining at times. Had a great witness to end the day with. All right, but first, music fact of the day. Real quick, want to say a big thank you to Brad, Stacy, and Rebecca for the donations. I really appreciate that. Okay, music fact of the day. So the song Me and Bobby McGee, which is my go-to karaoke song, always has been. It was co-written by Chris Christopherson and Fred Foster. So how the story of the song came to be is that Fred Foster had a secretary named Bobby McKee, not McGee, McKee. And she was a secretary at a record label he was working at. And several times one day, he kept running down to his boss's office. And his boss said, "You're not coming here to see me. You're coming to see Bobby McKee." So he said, "One day I'm going to write a song about Bobby McKee." So Chris Christopherson was a new hire there. He was a Texas-born athlete and an Army veteran and had been trying to break through into the business as a songwriter. So he actually worked as a janitor in a Music Row recording studio. After hearing some of his songs, Foster said he would only hire Christopherson as a songwriter if he also signed a record deal. So in 1969, Foster called up Christopherson and said, "Hey, I got an idea for this song, and it's Bobby McKee, and she's a woman." So Christopherson changed it up a little bit, changing McKee to McGee, and invented a road song story about a pair of travelers who drifted apart. And Janis Joplin made it the best song I think she's ever done. Piece of My Heart was really good too. But I love all of Janis Joplin's stuff. But in Janis Joplin's version, she switched the lyrics up and made Bobby McGee a man. The real turning point for the song, though, was Janis Joplin's version, which was released on her 1971 album Pearl after her death. And in fact, Foster and Christopherson had no idea she had cut the song until legendary producer Clive Davis told them eventually. So I just love that song, and her version is amazing. All right, so day 22, part 2. Here we go. Before lunch, we had the BCI agent Jennifer, who was there interviewing Angela at the border crossing. She was on cross-exam. So this kind of went weird for a second. So the defense is Parker up. He said, "You're assigned right when it happened, and you've been on it ever since until 2 years ago, talking about the case. Did you know you would be interviewing Angela?" And she said she was aware of who her subject would be. And he asks if she wore the device to record, and she said it was actually in her portfolio. And she said that was essentially her function of being there, was to have that. And he asked if it was video recorded, and she said some of it, but not all. And he asked, did she research Angela's background before the interview? And she said she read the documents. And the defense asked, were you aware she was in the Air Force? And she said she wasn't until that interview with Angela. And then this is where it gets really, I don't know where he was going. I think just to say Angela's a big liar about a lot of stuff. But he says, do you remember she lived on Bethel Hill and was involved in some fraudulent arsons there? And she said, yes. Did you know one of the rooms on Bethel Hill had a marijuana grow room in the basement? No. Were you aware of her dog breeding business? She said, I don't know if I knew at the time. So you're not sure she falsely represented the dogs as thoroughbred, even though they weren't. She says, no, at this point, this is her face, y'all. She's just like, before this, she was all smiles and happy. And then she literally is like scratching her head, y'all. It was so funny. You have to go back and watch it. And then he says, you're not sure she falsely reported the dogs as being thoroughbred. And she said, no. Are you aware she thought Sophia was being abused before the murders? She says, no. Do you know she wanted Billy to do something about that? She says, no. Are you aware of Tabitha's personal history? And she said, I know her, but not her history. After the interview, you said she was free to go. She said, right. Do you know Angela thought one of the Border Patrol agents drugged one of the grandkids and stopped at a hotel or a hospital outside of town? And she said, no. That's interesting. I did not know that. She was so paranoid. It makes you wonder. I mean, not that I'm excusing anything, but it makes you wonder if something happened to her as a kid because she was so obsessed and so fearful and almost convincing herself that things had happened when there's never really been any evidence to the contrary, or that anything had happened. And so he says, do you know about the social media site Topics? And she said her knowledge was limited. It's open forum for people to comment about things. And so Parker says, your partner said they wanted to get away from the noise in Pike County. And she said, I don't know what he was referring to. So Parker says from April 16th, April 2016, the interview this was a hot topic in this community. Or he's saying from April 2016 to the time of the interview, this was a hot topic in the community. And she said, yes. The defense says, Angela said Jake was devastated at Hannah Mae's murder. And then you later learned Jake murdered Hannah Mae. And Angela was alone in the Walmart buying shoes. And she said, yes. The defense says, were you aware Angela would go to Florida with Billy to bring back pills illegally? And she says, no. And like she scratches her head again, like, where are you going with this? So the defense says, it's fair to say that Angela has been deceitful. And she said about some things, yes. The prosecution comes back up and said, he said Angela was alone in Walmart, but in the car, was she alone? And the agent said, Jennifer said, no, she got back in the back of the vehicle. And if you look on the side there, there's somebody in the passenger seat. So clearly Jake and George are in the front seat. All right. So this last witness, okay, I'm going to tell you right now, the whole time he was testifying, all I could hear in my head was the Dukes of Hazzard song, Just a Good Old Boy. Because this dude was hilarious. And I cannot believe that him and Angela are cut from the same cloth, or at least half the cloth, because Angela is his half sister, and they are 20 years apart. He's 20 years younger. So he's really close to George and Jake's age. So they share the same mother, Rita Newcomb, who was arrested in the case and then admitted that she lied. And, so he is a year and a half older than George and about 2.5 years older than Jake. So he lives in the home the Wagners were in until they were arrested, which I believe was Angela's dad's home. He died when they were in Alaska. At no point in their life did they live in the same home. She was already at the Bethel Hill house with Billy and the boys and like 50 dogs, is what he says. He spent time with Jake and George growing up, and they were close. They would hunt, fish, camp, ride four-wheelers, fix cars. They were always preparing for hunting season. He said if it wasn't hunting season, they were getting ready for it. He said the family dynamics were that of a close family, and the boys had a handful of friends besides him. He didn't go to Peterson Road as much once they moved there. He helped them build stuff and bought some scrap off of them, but didn't really think he had hunted there. And he had started his family at this point as well. His first baby was born July 1st, 2016. So he said the Wagners moved into Angela's dad's home after they moved back from Alaska, and she didn't come back for the funeral, by the way. Just, I'm not surprised, but still, that's your dad. He said Angela was controlling as all get out with Jake and George. She would tell them to jump, they would jump. And with Billy, her relationship, he said, was dysfunctional. If you knew Billy, you'd know why he was dysfunctional. Okay, pardon me, guys. He said he was as useless as tits on a boar hog. This dude. Okay, so I'm going to tell you, this is probably one of those guys. I know a million guys like him growing up in the South that are just so funny. And he just seems like a really sweet guy. So he said Billy was lazy. Billy was always running his mouth, always scheming something. And this clearly was an issue with Chris. He said he was grinding his teeth beyond recognition. Apparently, Billy had a bad habit of constantly grinding his teeth. He figured Billy was living at Flying W because when he went to the Peterson Road address, Billy was never there. Now, here's the thing. He was asked about Beth Ann, which is the woman that Jake married in Alaska, and she lived with them at the new house. So he didn't even know that Jake had gotten married. Now, here's my question. I want to know if she crossed the border with them because we never heard anything about Beth Ann being there. Maybe she came after. If you guys know that, shoot me something in the comments. He knew about the family meetings that the Wagners would have, and they'd say they were having one and he would go somewhere else. He said that George was super protective of Jake because George was the older brother. Angela tried to be more of a mother to Vine and Sophia than she should have been, he said as well. He said she tried to be controlling with him about his own kids, but he said he put a stop to that really quick. So he just said he was recently laid off, but he does sell scraps and he's done this for a long time. And at times he would help George and Jake find things they were looking for, like certain types of guns. He helped George get a 40 Glock, and they met at a truck stop one time to meet a seller he had found on Facebook Marketplace, and George drove himself, but he kind of would be the middleman too for getting guns. George asked for some more rare kind of guns that he couldn't find, but he did find him a second Glock. Jake never asked for much from him as far as weapons go. He did know George's wife, Tabby, and it was really sweet. He said Hannah Mae was like a little sister to him, and they were very good friends. He said they texted almost every day for a very long time, and after her and Jake broke up was around the time his wife got pregnant, and they kind of lost touch. But he said he always thought the world of her, and she was a great mother, and you could just look at his face and tell. He was super sincere about that. He said he knew Frankie and little Chris when little Chris was real little, and he met them at the Bethel Hill house. He said Frankie was a heck of a good boy. If they saw each other out, they would talk. The last time he saw Frankie was at a Ross County Trade Days. He said he told Frankie, "You're eating at the first table." He said he had gotten taller and put on some weight. He had his son with him, and his son wanted to buy a pony off of Chris, and Frankie said no. He said this was 3 to 4 years before the homicide. He also said he's not great with dates, and that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because at the time of the homicides, Brentley was 3, so it had to have been. And look, these happened in 2016. It's 2022. I'm sure the dates get fuzzy after everything, even he's been through. So he went to Union Hill Road maybe one time, if that. He wasn't sure. And then they talk about The Walking Dead. So he's familiar with The Walking Dead, lots of zombies. And he's asked if Jake is a fan of the show, and he said yes. And he's also asked the favorite movie of both Jake and George, and he says The Boondock Saints. And he said they were just randomly discussing it one day, naming their favorite movies. And he said, for the record, his was anything with John Wayne. He said the movie The Boondock Saints is about 2 brothers and their idiot friend killing a bunch of mafia guys and hitmen and anyone who has had anything to do with the mafia. The father joins them in Boondock Saints 2. He saw that Jake and George with their hair dyed dark. He said they showed up at the house and he told them it looked stupid. He said Jake was laughing and said, "Don't you think I look like Daryl from The Walking Dead, who's played by Norman Reedus and who is also in the Boondock Saints?" It sounds like maybe Jake had, like a man crush on Norman Reedus because he apparently just talked about him a lot. I mean, I kind of have a woman crush on Norman Reedus too, so can't say much. She asked how close to the homicides it was, and he said it was either right before or right after when he saw them with that dark hair. He talked about playing poker, says he likes to gamble. So him and his friends have poker games, and actually he knows the son of one of George's defense attorneys, Nash. Nash has known Chris Newcomb all of his life, and he's actually played cards with him a couple of times. And he asked something about, the prosecutor asked something about money, and he said, yeah, he only a couple of times because he lost a little money. And so it was kind of a light moment. This guy you couldn't have a bad moment with. But again, okay, so here's my thing. We had that one witness for George, who was the girl who you could tell probably had a huge crush on him in the day. And they just went, George got married, she got married, had her babies or whatever. And she was just a really good witness, but she was a good witness for George. And it was just because she was being honest about her feelings. I'm not knocking her. This is the same way with Chris that I felt today. Amazing guy, genuine. Like, he's one of the people you don't doubt anything coming out of his mouth. You don't think he's fudging it or blowing it up to be more than it is. But again, this testimony to me benefited George way more than it benefited the state. It humanized George again. So I've been a little curious today why those two. I'm not sure what the state wanted to accomplish with bringing those two on as state witnesses. But anyways, so he was asked about the fires on Bethel Hill, and he knew of houses, trucks, hay fields, and a dog kennel that burned down on Bethel Hill. He was a little bit younger when that happened, and there were a few things that made him suspicious. He said, like, Angela had some things in the house, her favorite little statues, and they always seemed to survive any fire. It would be back in the house, the new house. After the murders, he was in a really super bad accident in George's truck with Jake. So remember last week, we saw something on a calendar about Chris had all these injuries. Jake had these injuries. So what it is, Jake was swerving to miss a deer, and they kind of hit a ditch or a bank, and then they hit a tree, and he almost died. Chris almost died. She asked if the accident was intentional, and he said, well, not on my part. He broke a lot of the right side of his body, tore the meniscus in his knee. I've had that. No fun. And a concussion. It took them 4 hours to cut him out of the car. And he said the engine actually came through the cab and was in his lap. They had to life flight him to the hospital. So there were some objections, but the prosecution essentially said, were you encouraged to sue George's insurance company? Objection. And he collected on the insurance. So the term Winter Olympics, I believe they said, meant coyote hunting. Jake and George are both mechanics. George is the better mechanic by far. Billy had told him that stealing diesel fuel means you don't have to buy it. He used a pump that he could switch to get the gas out quickly. He also said Billy used pills, and actually Billy would have Chris go to some doctor for obesity, and Billy would give him money, and the doctor would give him 3 bottles of pills, and he would take that to Billy. So interesting. You can get what I'm assuming to be pain pills for obesity. And it just, it's actually really sad if you think about it, with the epidemic in this country with opioids, and how what I now know to be pill mills, thanks to you guys for enlightening me, how easy I guess it is to get this stuff when people who actually need it, that are seriously hurting, have a really hard time getting anything stronger than Tylenol these days for pain. He knew about George's tattoo of the skull and the 8 ball in the skull's mouth. And he was interviewed twice by Agent Scheider and other agents. Once while the Wagners were in Alaska, and once when they were back home, Angela, Jake, and George told him not to talk to investigators. So prior to Jake pleading guilty, he said that he defended the Wagners, and he was enraged when he found out that Jake had confessed. He said something like that should have never been done. It's monstrous. He said he would have beaten Jake within an inch of his life if he was in front of him when he found out. He really must have defended the family up until this. He said he was mostly mad at Angela and Jake, and he tried not to think about Billy at all. You could tell he hated Billy. His mom, Rita, as we know, was charged in the case, and he felt very betrayed. He said ultimately, he defended them, and it made him feel like an idiot in the whole community for defending them for so long. So after he knew they were involved, he looked back at some of the things BCI asked him about that made no sense at the time that started making sense. He did not elaborate. I wish he had. He saw a profile picture on George's Facebook of a wolf missing an eye. And this was after the murders, I believe. And he said it just kind of was ironic to him because we know Kenneth was shot in the eye and everybody else was shot in the face or the head. So on cross, Parker was just sweet as pie, y'all. This was like his dream cross exam. He never got mean. And it could be, look, you can tell the affection that Chris still has for George is very evident. And I think with him knowing Nash and having grown up with his son, it's one of those witnesses, you don't bust him too hard because there's sentimental stuff there. And Parker was, look, if Parker does this with all his witnesses, I'm not dreading their case as much as I thought I was. But Parker says, if you don't understand something, let me know. And he said, I will, because I'm not the brightest crayon in the box. He asked George to stand up and talks about how much weight George has lost. And Chris said, yeah, he lost it and I found it. He said, you grew up like brothers and you know Jake. And he said, yeah, of course. He said, are George and Jake the same? And he said, nope, they're night and day. He said him and George vibed a lot better, just had the same interest, and Jake, not so much. He said they were all like brothers, but he said George was the brother I always wanted, and Jake was the brother I wish I never had. And I thought that was very powerful because, listen, y'all, you got a jury of 12 people here, and majority of these jurors are women. So I respect the prosecution. I've rewatched some hearings in my downtime from the past, and you see the toll that this case has taken on Angela throughout the years. She's worked very, very hard in getting justice for the Rodens and Hannah Gilley. But I don't know. I was talking to somebody recently about this case, and somebody said, do you think he's going to get convicted? And I said, I'm not sure. You got a jury of 12. If one person, all it takes is one, feels sorry for George in a way because he wasn't Angela's favorite and seemed to always get the short end of the stick, then that could be a hung jury. I'm still very concerned about the fact that up to day 22, we have had nothing that has been solid against George. And in fact, we've had a couple of witnesses that have humanized him to the jury. And there were times where during Chris's testimony, I think I maybe heard some jurors laughing or somebody in the seats. But nonetheless, I'm not sure what they have on George. I've always heard it was the weakest case against all four. But anyways, I'm sorry. That's just something I've been thinking about all day, which is there anything, if I were sitting in that jury box, is there anything I've heard so far other than a shoe print that you can't prove was George and Jake's confession that George was there? So far, have we heard anything concrete? Juries like forensic evidence or confessions or whatever, it's just, it makes it easy if you've got definitive proof. Yes, this his bloody fingerprint was on the door frame. That makes it a little easier. I just don't think we've got there yet, y'all. I'm hoping that the wiretaps is what they're waiting on, or some surprise, some ace up their sleeve. And maybe that's what they're waiting on, is to make that very impactful before they hand it to the state or to the defense. I don't know. Back to it. Sorry, y'all. Chris said that Jake was very OCD, picky to the point that if he had dirt on his boots, he would have to take them off, put them in a garbage or a grocery bag, and put that bag in the bed of the truck. No trash in it. George was the opposite. He said we could be out mudding and covered, and George would say, hop in. So the defense says, you grew up at the Flying W Farms. He said, yeah, him and George would go four-wheeling. They would get dirty. Jake did not get muddy. They were different personalities, just opposites. So the defense says, if I thought of you, I'm sorry. The defense says to Chris, if I told you George thought of you more as a brother than he did Jake, would that surprise you? And Chris said no. So the defense talks about hunting, and Chris said they hunted a lot. The defense says George was obsessed with deer hunting, and Chris said, yeah, he wanted to have his own hunting show from when he was a little boy. And he said he was smart enough to do it. And you kind of see a little sadness in his eyes. He said, but it never happened. So he says, Angela's your half sister. And he hesitates and says, yes. The defense says you're embarrassed about what Jake and Angela did. After she pled guilty, she called him and they yelled at each other. And then he just blocked her number. He said them pleading guilty blindsided him. And he thought there's no way any of them had anything to do with the murders. It was so embarrassing for him. So they go back to the deer hunting. From a young age, George would do all the work when it was hunting season. Apparently, George would plant things to attract deer like carrots. He would look over at George almost for validation because he would say beets, and he looked kind of over at George and say carrots. You know, he looked over at George several times. I think they probably made some eye contact. You have to wonder what that makes George feel like, to sit and look at pictures of his home, to look at pictures of his grandma's home where he grew up, you know, those places, and then to have your friends and now somebody who you considered a brother up on the stand, testifying technically against you, even though he really didn't. You have to wonder what goes through George's mind sitting there. I would love to know. So the defense says it sounds like, Chris said George wouldn't shoot every deer he saw. It had to be mature. He never shot a juvenile deer because he wanted to preserve the ability for the deer to keep breeding. And the defense says it sounds like he was raising deer. And Chris said he was 3 times the hunter I ever was. He said Jake was just lazy. The defense says George wanted to be away from that house as much as he could. And Chris said, yeah, there was a lot of tension in that house. And he argued a lot with Angela. And the defense said that Angela had told Chris that he was a bad influence on George. And the defense says, would it surprise you if George said you were his role model? And so there's an objection by the state because, you know, they're thinking what I'm thinking, which is, you know, you're humanizing George. You're making him seem like a decent guy. So the defense asked, was George a smoker? And he said, every now and then. And then he asked, George was shy when he was younger. And he said, yeah, he came out of it. And the defense said, you showed him the rules of the road. And he said, yeah. So he said, you and George would hunt, smoke, chase girls. Was Jake like that? And he said, no. He said, tell us about I don't know where he was going with this, y'all. He said, tell us about the bedroom Jake had. And he said, it was the biggest room in the house and it was hot peak. And he also said that Jake swore Sophie's favorite song was My Little Pony. And he played it going down the road. And he said Jake was singing it super loud. And Chris asked, why is he singing this and playing this song? And Jake said, well, it's Sophie's favorite song. And Chris said, but Sophie's not here. Okay. That went like, I don't even know if that went left field, y'all. That went like into the parking lot. That was just so random. So he talks about how he flipped merchandise. He traveled a lot. Chris did. He rode the rodeo for 3 years, and he would go to stockyards when he wasn't riding. He would trade horses, cattle, guns, cars. He said he would trade a box of flies if he thought it would make money. The defense says you knew George was a hunter and liked guns, so he would come to you and tell you what he wanted, and that's no big deal. And he said, nope, not a big deal. Defense says, tell us about Billy. And he said, well, he's useless in my opinion. He said he's special and not in a good way. He thought he could trade, but I don't think anybody would like him long enough to trade. So the defense is like, ooh, tell me more. And Chris said he's arrogant, he's pushy, and he said he grinds his teeth. You can't be around him for more than 5 minutes. He said, I guarantee you it would echo in this room. So clearly that was something, people, I can't stand to hear people chew. It just, there's a name for it, but it makes me want to punch things. So he also said Billy didn't hold jobs long and he loved to be on the couch. He had heard Billy talk about going to Mexico a few times, and he said he was always trying to come up with some get-rich-quick plan. He said if he actually worked at getting rich, maybe he would have. George talked about when they went to Alaska for years prior. Years prior. So way before the murders, the family had went to Alaska, and it was influential on George. And they all wanted to move there. They just love the landscape. And this trip happened when George was a teenager, and they talked about hunting up there. So he wasn't surprised when he heard they were moving to Alaska after the murders. He kept in touch with George while they were there. And then he talked about how George would do anything for him no matter what time of day. If he needed anybody, he knew he could call George. It was the same thing that girl said too, essentially, which again would have been a much better defense witness. He said George would try to stay away from the house. Angela didn't like it. She would get in his face and tell him he was going to hell if he didn't change his ways. And she did this with Chris, the witness, too. She didn't do that to Jake. And he said she clearly favored Jake over George. And she always took Jake's side no matter what, which has been testified to in the past as well. He was aware of the fires. And then he talked again about the special items that would always survive. After they moved back from Alaska, Jake brought his wife, and I just want to find out if she crossed the border. She lived in that house with them, and he said she was weird. I should have screenshotted this, y'all. Here's Chris, by the way. He said she was weird. He said she would hold eye contact way longer than she should, and it was odd. And then he made a face like bulging eyes. It was hysterical, y'all. I need to find a clip. He thought Jake and Beth were a good match. He said Billy was abusive with George and Jake in his eyes. He said the boys always had bruises on them, and Billy was all bark and no bite. And he said it got to a point to where as they got older, it was more verbal abuse because he said George could whoop Billy by then. He said he had seen a few fights between George and Billy, and he would and that George would stand up to Angela too. George would be very protective of Jake. However, I think especially with Billy, and Angela and George argued a ton. So on Bethel Hill, he knew Billy was a thief. He would steal semi-trailers, fuel, trailer full of Rocky boots. Him and Angela were arrested for that. So when Jake was younger, he was a computer guy, loved video games, kind of the opposite of George, where if it was daylight hours, George and Chris would be outside playing. And he was talking about Jake kind of being OCD, and he talked about a bunch of action figures he had, and he would line them up real neatly in a row. And there's just a couple of things about Jake, like the My Little Pony thing and the pink room and the OCD. I don't know why the defense is bringing this stuff up. I mean, I guess when they present their case, maybe they're going to say that that's the reason, everything was so meticulous because Jake was OCD. And I mean, look, you can sit here and say it, but it took 2 years. And if they had picked up their shell casings on Peterson Road, they might not be here today. So he wasn't that OCD. He was very neat. He said everything had a place and a place for everything. That was Jake saying, or something to that nature. George wasn't that way, but he was very neat with his tools. Jake never rebelled against Angela, and he never saw Jake and Angela argue. She said something, and Jake did it. George talked about moving away several times. Jake was arrogant, and he said Angela was even worse. At one time, Angela accused him of stealing money from them, not to his face, but he heard secondhand that she was insinuating he did. And she also said, this was funny, his reaction to this was priceless. He said she also told him he would never amount to nothing and would spend his life in prison. And he made a face and he said, "Oh, that's funny, ain't it?" She always made up excuses for Jake, always lied for Jake even. That's what the defense was trying to get out. It was being objected to, but when they moved to Peterson, he spent a little time there. Parker shows him a photo of a barn, and he said he actually helped build that barn. It took a few months because they weren't on that constantly. He also shows him a photo of a truck and asks if he's seen it before, and Chris says no. I think maybe they're going to talk about the murder truck. He said George only liked diesel engines, and I think he said a Comet. I don't know what he's talking about. Apparently, George has some kind of a Comet diesel tattoo. He had, yeah. And so he said, BCI showed you a hand holding a Colt 11. Haven't you ever seen that gun before? And he said, no. He saw Billy and George screaming, yelling, a few swings here and there. Chris said he kept calling it. At one point, he talked about Billy kind of being just all talk, no action, all bark, no bite. And he said that there was a week where Billy kept calling him gay, but he wasn't calling him gay. He was calling him a very offensive word, which I will not say. But it went on for a week. And he told Billy, he said, I can take a joke, but he said, I'm going to roll your hind end on this ground if you keep saying that to me. So he said, Billy came up to me and he said, I'm only eye level with his nipple because he's a big old brute. Y'all, this guy, I swear to God, he's so funny. He got in his ear and said it again. So Chris said he flipped him on the ground and Angela yelled to stop because Billy was turning blue. Jake dressed differently than George. He said he wore a lot of Pokemon stuff and he liked The Walking Dead a lot. He was asked if George was strong and he said he was strong as an ox. He never knew Billy broke his back, as Angela said he did. And she asks if George had an SKS gun and he said yes, several. He said either at one point I got one off of him or he got one off of me. In the end, she gets so finally, Angela's back up, and she's got to do a little damage control. But in the end, she gets Chris to say that eventually George would do what Angela wanted him to. He said one time, too, remember, his son was born July 1st. This is Chris we're talking about, Angela's brother, half-brother. So they didn't come to a July 4th party after his son's birth, which was 3 days before, because they had just gotten home from the hospital. So Angela posted a really nasty comment on his girlfriend's post saying she was a terrible mom for keeping that baby away from the family. And Chris stopped by the party for a minute and told Angela she could come see the baby, that his girlfriend isn't going anywhere until she's healed up from giving birth and she actually feels like leaving the house. He said it was a really heated conversation. He talked to both Angela and Jake after they pled guilty. He learned about Jake's guilty plea about 10 minutes before Jake called, and he didn't know if either Angela called first or Jake did. He said Chris said he himself was emotional during the calls. He was mad. He couldn't remember if he cried, but he said he could have been. He also had a conversation with George after the guilty pleas. It was a while after. He said he wasn't as upset with George because he had time to process it, but he said he was still pretty mad. The defense asked, do you love George as a brother? And he said, yeah. He said, do you feel the same about Jake or Angela? And Chris said no. So the prosecution says, you were asked if you still love George. Do you feel betrayed? And he said, yes. Do I think we would ever be close? Probably not, but he's the only one I remotely miss out of all of them. And he was moving his hands like he's the only one I remotely miss. So the defense, one more time, gets up. You welcome back in your home. And he said, well, that'd be getting a little close. So that ended his testimony. Great witness. Great witness. Would have been better for the defense, I think. But it's hard to think that him and Angela shared the same uterus for 9 months at one point, because just polar opposites. Just a good-hearted, good old boy, take the shirt off his back, kind of Southern boy is just the vibe I got. And clearly didn't get that gene that clearly Angela got that made her a monster. So anyways, all right, tomorrow, Friday, don't know who's testifying, but I will bring you the best of it tomorrow evening early. And then we will just march into the weekend. All right, guys. Hope you have a good one. We'll see you soon.
My brother-in-law died suddenly, and now my sister and her kids have to sell their home. That's why I told my husband we could not put off getting life insurance any longer. An agent offered us a 10-year, $500,000 policy for nearly $50 a month. Then we called SelectQuote. SelectQuote found us identical coverage for only $19 a month, a savings of $369 a year.
Whether you need a $500,000 policy or a $5 million policy, SelectQuote could save you more than 50% on term life insurance.
For your free quote, go to SelectQuote.com. SelectQuote.com. That's SelectQuote.com.
SelectQuote. We shop. You save. Full details on example policies at SelectQuote.com/commercials.
With the Lucky Land Slots, you can get lucky just about anywhere.
This is your captain speaking. We've got clear runway and the weather's fine, but we're just going to circle up here a while and get lucky. No, nothing like that. It's just these cash prizes add up quick. So I suggest you sit back, keep your tray table upright, and start getting lucky.
Play for free at LuckyLandSlots.com. Are you feeling lucky? No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+ terms and conditions apply. See website for details.